all this talk about generative AI has raised two different kinds of questions that are both really interesting. One question has to do with job replacement. To what extent is generative AI? And usually people are thinking about large language models. How are they going to potentially replace people by automating jobs away? That's one kind of concern that comes up. There's another kind of concern that comes up that has to do with something like human creativity. What does it mean to be creative in the world of generative AI? And this conversation usually comes up in the context of things like Midjourney, where it's generating images or in some cases videos. So you've got the automation problem and some potential job loss. You've got how do we think about human creativity given the existence now of generative AI? And then there's also a third conversation that's somewhat related, which has to do with what is it going to be like for students in educational institutions given generative AI? There's been lots of talk about this in the educational sector. As a former professor, I'm particularly sympathetic and interested too in that debate. And I wanted to talk about all these issues, and I realized that one of my very closest friends, Eric Corriel, checks all the boxes. I've known Eric since I'm 18. We hang out all the time. And so when we talk about these things all the time, Eric is, in a sense, uniquely positioned to give some insight here because, number one, he's an artist. He's shown his work around the world. Number two, he works at a higher education institution. So he works at the School of Visual Arts in New York, where he does a lot of their web design and things like that. And so he has access to and understanding of what administrators are talking about with regards to generative AI. And he teaches his own classes. He teaches students. So he has a lot to say about job automation and generative AI and cheating or something like that, something along those lines in the context of school, and things to say about the nature of human creativity and how it relates to generative AI. So the conversation with Eric was, it's fascinating, but we talk about fascinating things all the time. And in a way, this is sort of me letting you in on a conversation that I have with a good friend of mine way too often. We have the conversation way too often. Anyway, I say this really clunky thing at the end of these things. I usually say something like, I hope you enjoy it, but more than that, I hope you get something out of it. It's so clunky, right? But it's really what I hope for it. So what I hope that you're getting out of these conversations, the podcast, is not just, oh, that was fun, or that was a fun conversation, but that you're pulling something away from this. And I think there's a lot to walk away from with this conversation. I'll also mention before we get into it, if you like the podcast, then, why wouldn't you? You're here, you're listening. It's good, no? Click on the 5-star thing, write a review. I'd really appreciate it. Always trying to get the word out and get more people to listen to the podcast for obvious reasons. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy it. And, as I said, you get something out of it. All right, Eric, you were telling me that there are a number of fears that artists have around generative AI. Tell me what those fears are.
So, there are a bunch, right? So if you're a professional, quote unquote, image maker, it used to be the case that you were the only person or the only people in town who kind of do that kind of thing. And now that has been democratized. And so naturally people kind of fear for whether or not this technology is going to come for their jobs. It's probably fear number one. If you're a student, along with a lot of the students that I teach at School of Visual Arts in New York City, you might be wondering whether or not certain professions are going to be as viable as they are now, particularly like illustration, photography. Those seem to be very much in the purview of this technology.
This is like a subset of the first one. And coming from my job today or coming from my job tomorrow.
Sure, but there are questions about whether or not whole domains are going to be kind of relegated to some sort of like creative sideline, or like illustration, for example, or like photography. So there are post-photography photographers. Those are photographers that no longer need a camera to create photographic imagery, right? So it used to be the case when you were a photography major or a professional photographer and you need to organize a shoot, that you would, contract a model, then you would get your location set up, then you would have to carry your lights and your insurance, all these kind of, probably even a photo assistant to make sure everything goes well. Nowadays, if you're of a certain ilk, then you might forgo all of that, not even buy a camera, not even bother with a model or insurance, and, start your prompts with Midjourney or DALL-E. And the results that you get, to an untrained and even to many trained eyes, is, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from a quote unquote real life shoot. So, you have photographers wondering about how much of the camera do I need to know? How much of the technique do I need to know, right? We don't teach dark rooms and chemicals anymore at SVA. So do we still teach studio photography? Do we still teach cameras? Do we still teach technique, and to what degree? So those are some questions about the domain, that specific domain.
So that's interesting because it's a fear that students have that I'm specializing in something that's going to be nothingness, now or tomorrow in the relatively near future. And then schools have to make substantive decisions about what they still teach. Do we still teach the stuff when we suspect it might go completely out of fashion? It might go the way of the darkroom.
Right. Or of course, the third option, which is, how do we evolve with this technology? What is photography? What is quote unquote post camera photography? So, I think what a lot of institutions are starting to do is starting to figure out, especially, pedagogically, how do they incorporate this technology into the curriculum? What does it mean to, teach this kind of technology alongside traditional techniques? And don't forget, when you are, or anybody is, creating these prompts, obviously quality in, quality out. So the more that you know about the history of the domain, for example, if you want to create a photograph in the style of Ansel Adams, well, you better know who Ansel Adams was and what kind of style his photography exhibited. So you really do need, if you're going to aim to differentiate yourself in this new creative sphere, I do think that, a foundational education is more important than ever. And even knowing the techniques that have defined a lot of these genres as well.
Okay, so you think something like, we've talked about this before, and you said something like, it might be the case, I think you said this, it might be the case that certain sort of rough drafts are not going to be done by people anymore. They'll be done by generative AI. But that's sort of the role of creative director everyone's going to be a creative director of their own photograph now, where the creative director gets the rough draft from the novice and says, change this color, flip this around, this is too dark, this is too light, et cetera, and sort of massages what needs to be done. And
Yeah.
it sounds like you're saying that's going to need to be done. And in order for anyone to do that well, they're going to have to actually have the expertise that we train for today.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think that people are way too optimistic about the potentials of this technology in the creative domain as well. Let me just limit it to at least the visual arts. I went through a round of about 200 to 300 student reviews at the end of the previous semester. And I saw virtually zero students, seniors, using this technology in their final works. And you kind of have to
Is
think
that because
about,
of them or because the technology is not there yet? Are the students
well,
not there yet, or is the technology
no,
not
the
there
students are there. The students are going to, the students are like, they're going to find the path of least resistance. So if there's a way for them to use this technology to create their final products, they will, if it's going to save them a few hours or even minutes. But, the technology, I don't know if it's a question of the technology being there or not. It is very, very difficult when you get to a high level of probably any profession, but I'll just limit it to the visual art. You become very specific about what it is exactly that you want to render, that you want to see. And the technology right now is like very much in rough draft mode. And, you can't really manipulate it. And maybe this is just a function of time and technological advancement, but at least at the current state of things, it is very, very difficult to wield it in extremely precise ways,
It's a broad
So
brush, not a fine tip brush.
it's a very broad brush, which is useful for, like very, as you were suggesting, very, very rough drafts, or mood boarding is what I see it used for the most actually these days. Being able to show somebody an idea, extremely quickly. That's great for that. It's also good for when you don't have a very specific idea of what you want to be rendered, right? If your mind is an open canvas, then it's going to fill that in with something that looks, pretty magical, and you're going to be fine with that. But, professionals aren't really open canvas kind of people. They have very directed sense of what they want.
So what about this thought that it somehow curtails creativity? That it's doing, this is not a visual arts thing, but this is in a case of writing. So I do quite a bit of writing, and I find that in writing, my thoughts evolve, my thoughts develop. The act of writing, the act of rewriting, deleting the sentence, deleting that word, thinking about how I want to put this phrase or how I want to frame the article or the book or the whatever it is. The act of writing is an act of thinking, to put it in a pithy way. And so suppose I say something like, you would think that the act of, let's just say, painting, or the act of choosing the settings and the angle and the lighting and et cetera, for the photograph you're going to take, that is an act those are acts of thinking. Those are acts of creativity. And by using this stuff, you're decreasing something like decreasing human creativity, or you're taking out a distinctive human element, or something along those lines. Think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a really interesting topic. And, we're going to, in the arts, we've been very, if you take any kind of studio course, any serious course in graphic design, illustration, photography, you name it, the instructor or the professor is going to be very interested in like the show your work part of it. Like, what was the process by which
Mm.
you arrived at this result? And from a pedagogical standpoint, that's obviously important, right? You want to see how your students are thinking. You want to be able to, pick up on any errors, or if they missed maybe this reference or that reference, you can kind of fill them in, make the final work better. But what I think is going to be interesting is we're going to put this to the test, right? We're going to see if we really do value process. If that's what value does it really have? And I of course, I agree with you, right? But we might be of an old guard who learned a certain way, and we might be,
I don't know. I mean, these, and I mean, I know that and like philosophy of art, we've asked these questions before AI was creating stuff. Suppose someone trips over a bunch of cans of paint they dropped, and they
right.
create something visually indistinguishable from a Jackson Pollock piece. Does it have the same value as a Jackson Pollock? And the intuitive answer is no, of course not. Because there's something about the intention of the artist that has to lie behind the artwork in order for it to have some kind of meaning. And then we just say the same thing about the AI stuff. So, maybe it's old guard, but I sort of think, I don't know. I don't think it's an old guard thing. I just think it's sort of, we think that artwork, and here we should highlight that we're talking about like really fine art. Like, we're not talking about marketing materials, right? But for real art, if you like, fine art, it just seems to me that that a necessary condition for having some aesthetic, if I want to say this, I'm going to put it really strongly. You tell me I'm wrong. Or we're right, for that matter. For it to have aesthetic value, a necessary condition is that it be expressive of, in fact, someone or other, the artist's intentions, emotions, attitudes, feelings, blah, blah, blah.
I don't know. That's probably a contentious claim. There could be artworks for which the artist might not be fully cognizant of their intentions, or might be guided by more intuition or even instinct.
That's still a case in which the art is expressive of some mental states of which the artist is unaware.
Well, if even using these tools, like there are lots of artists these days who are, depending on how you want to define this, quote unquote, AI artists, which typically means that they use or they rely on AI as part of their creative process, and they're in dialogue with these image generating tools. And I don't think that they have any less of a claim on, quote unquote, creating art because they're making use of these tools. I think what you're trying to get at is maybe somebody who goes into one of these like chatbot things and maybe says, create me an image of a unicorn, holding a hot dog with mustard and little minions on it. Is that person creating art? And this is where I think the interesting question is, because what we've seen is that the barrier or the bar, so to speak, for creating what used to be typically called art has definitely been raised. If I would have showed you, even this time last year, a rendering, an illustration that somebody had spent creating, that same mythical, fantastical image I just described of, what was it, the hot dog with the unicorn, you would have looked at that, anybody would have looked at that and said, oh yeah, this seems like, this falls in the genre of creating art. Now, if somebody can create that same exact thing with a prompt in less than 5 seconds, that's where we have to reevaluate, well, how much of art is process? How much of it is, what goes into it? Or are we kind of process agnostic and think that, well, you know what, you could have created it in 5 seconds or 500 hours. It still maintains the same level of kind of artistic integrity.
And you think that's the case? You think that it exhibits the same level of artistic integrity?
No, I don't. I think that we're in the process of redefining what creativity is. I think these tools are helping us, or going to be, raising exactly this question. What do I think? I think that, demonstration of creativity is going to revolve more and more. I think it's going to be redefined in terms of process. Now, that's not to say that you can't use these tools and be creative. Obviously, yeah, you clearly can. But I just don't think, my intuition is to think that creating a prompt, creating an image in 5 seconds and calling that an act of creativity, most of the time, unless it's some kind of epiphany kind of a moment, is no longer going to be seen as creative by, by society in general, and certainly by, the professional class of artists and designers and creators. It's just we hold a higher bar for that, which is creative, and it needs to be kind of a non-obvious creation, and that's going to be something that we're going to have to debate out in the open.
Okay, so I take it it's still you still think it's going to be process driven, but it's not a matter of whether or not you use generative AI. It's the way in which it's involved in the process.
Yeah.
If it's 99% of the process, and you don't have sort of, if you like, real art or fine art or something along those
Yeah.
lines.
And and I'll say, like, I do think that we will not move on from this, but I do think that we will become inured to this kind of technology very, very quickly, and it will just set the bar higher for what constitutes, creativity, for what constitutes, unique work, for what constitutes, something that actually catches your eye. So, yeah, the bar for that which is going to be deemed creative is going to rise, and as professional artists and illustrators and designers, we are going to have to, it's going to be like, I make this analogy pretty often, but it's going to be kind of like what Squarespace did to web designers. Back before Squarespace, you had to really be a professional of the craft to create a website. Post Squarespace, not so the case. $10 a month, and you have a pretty good starter template.
Right, but if you want a really good website, you need an expert to
Yeah,
design
if you
design and build that website.
If you want a distinctive, creative, something that speaks to your singular voice and reason for being, then yeah, Squarespace isn't going to cut it. There are just too many others of them out there.
All right, so I mean that point is true both of fine art and just straight up commercial products then, right? Because the point is, yeah, you can get some marketing material that's generated with AI, but it's going to be the Squarespace of marketing material, which
Yeah,
in many cases is going to be suitable, just like Squarespace is suitable for lots of use cases. And you shouldn't
absolutely.
spend $50,000 plus on building a customized website.
Absolutely. And I think this should be celebrated. I think it's going to democratize image making. It's going to allow a whole lot of other people to get businesses and ventures and ideas off the ground quickly and easily. It should lead to, hopefully, a new renaissance in access for people to express their creative ideas. But at the same time, I think we have to remember, I mean, this is at least my opinion, that AI, at least in its current instantiation, is kind of an average, right? It is taking all that which has been done before, and it's a very, very fancy collagist, in my opinion. So, this is going to be great for a lot of use cases, but it's also going to, create lanes for people who need to be distinctive, who need to be, off the beaten path, who need to appeal to, that which hasn't been done before. And, there's going to be still room for professionals who are really good to create stuff that hasn't been seen before.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Let me try to push back on the analogy with Squarespace a little bit. Although I'll push a little bit. So Squarespace, you've got templates, and so literally, you go to a website, and a lot of times when it's Squarespace, you're looking at a Squarespace site. You just know what they look like. At least I feel like lots of people do. I know that you do. You're looking at a templated site, or a site that was built out of a template from Squarespace or something similar to Squarespace. And so things can look better. The custom web designers can make things look better because they're not working with a template. They can be really creative and draw outside the lines of the template instead of they have no templates. And so that's how you get that customized, specialized, expert look. But I suppose, I don't know, is generative AI is the right way to think about it in terms of it's providing a template such that it'll be sort of relatively easy to spot what's outside of that template?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fair question, and obviously, the answer is really to be determined. But my inclination is to think that most of the people using these tools, without a professional kind of training in, if they're creating, whatever field it is that they're creating, photography, illustration, advertising, people will typically tend to, put a prompt in. Again, you have to think of the mindset of people who are doing this. I think for the kinds of people that I have in mind, for whom, now they get to, there weren't professional image makers before, and now they can create imagery.
Sure.
They're going to be, for the most part, not have probably be okay with
mediocrity. They're going to create mediocre outputs, and they'll be like,
the average,
this is good enough.
Yeah, the good enough. And so I think we're going to quickly be able to spot the good enough stuff. I think it'll be a lot of people doing more or less the same thing, minor variations here and there. Of course, the canvas is much wider than the Squarespace analogy because you're not dealing with very, locked in templates. But I do think it will kind of tend towards a mean. And I do think that, as we become more and more, barraged with these kinds of imagery, they will just kind of fall into a kind of mental category of stuff that more or less we've seen before. It's not going to be
Yeah.
super distinctive looking.
And so give us insight into like how SVA or universities generally are thinking about this. Are they sort of generally on board with, look, nothing to panic about here. It's another tool in our tool belt. Our students will use it. We'll train them how to use it. It doesn't really upend anything internally. Is that, it sort of feels like that's what you're saying. So first of all, do I have you right that we're not looking at sort of fundamental disruption here. We're just looking at a really, impactful without being sort of disruptive of the foundations of artistic expertise. Is that a standard view?
I don't know about standard. I will say that in the last 6 months, I feel like, SVA has kind of been in like a time warp of sorts where it started off as people being very, standoffish towards the technology. And, fast forward to the end of the semester, we're in the summer now, preparing for fall. And it's almost now just transforming to an inevitability for the most part. So, but it's also important to remember, the history of technology and education. I was talking to the president of the college, and he likened this to back in the 80s when computers were first introduced into the classroom. And he had a revolt among faculty about how, computers can't create art and they're not coming in my classroom and it's cheating and it's a shortcut and, we can have it. And, fast forward to today, and you can see that same, we can graph this all the way back to the introduction of the calculator and so forth and so on. So I think those faculty members who have been around long enough, might have that viewpoint in mind. But then there are other faculty who realize that students being students, I don't know, more now, it always seems like they find the quickest ways to get the thing done.
Sure.
And there is a worry. There's definitely a genuine worry about how and when to integrate these tools. And, I know people are concerned about not integrating them too early because it might shortcut some important processes that, workflows that need to be developed. But I think there's going to be a hard limit to what you can actually enforce on that side. Students are going to do what students are going to do. And universities typically have to try to adapt.
Yeah. I remember, when this stuff first came out, including LLMs, some people were freaking out about the cheating. And then other people were saying things like, don't be ridiculous. You got to integrate this immediately. This is the future. What's wrong with these backwards teachers? And I sort of felt like it probably is going to be the future in some way or other, but Jesus, as a former professor myself, you give them a minute. Right? It's not like, oh, okay, now there's a new tool that's massively impactful. I now know exactly how my syllabus should be revised and what testing looks like and what student evaluation looks like. It's gotta, you gotta test it out in a number of settings, I would imagine.
Yeah, you have to, what I've been doing in my classes is getting students to be honest about the technology. So we do have, and obviously all academics do have, an academic integrity policy, which roughly speaking is, thou shalt not plagiarize or pass off as your work somebody else's work, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for my students, I think it's important to first get a sense of how students are using this technology. So if you're using ChatGPT for your essay, then show me highlighting in green the parts that ChatGPT generated. Let me see how well you either synthesize it or not. If you're using a tool like Midjourney,
The Rhine
very, very popular near the Rhine here. Then, let me know what the prompt is. And, among a lot of artists and designers that I see using this tool, just having the prompt as almost like the caption, like the credit, as you might credit a photographer, is becoming standard. And I think that's a good thing. So being
it's like
honest
Andy
about
Warhol. Everyone's got to Andy Warhol it. You take some original, you take some image. It's actually not it's an original generated image, and then it's a matter of what you do with it.
Yeah, of course. It's always the case.
Someone got to do something ironic where like they generate the AI and then their artistic move is just present the, you hear like it's a toilet and they're like, no, it's a work of art. And then you're like, it's purely generated by AI. And they're like, no, I'm presenting the generative AI as an original work.
Well, yeah. The day when we have truly AI, artists and art, I think will be, I kind of bristle at the use of the term AI artist, because mostly what I think a lot of artists who are doing, who are quote unquote, using this moniker, is like, well, you just really have a really fancy studio assistant, right? Who can create imagery for you in 5 seconds. You have your
Oh,
own
that's
little
a nice analogy.
personal
Right.
Da
And
Vinci
and
there.
and so right, famous artists, super successful artists have assistants do
Of
some of the
course.
sort of
Yeah.
grunt worky stuff.
Right. And have, since the time of Rembrandt
Mm.
and before. So,
So would
that,
like a Rembrandt have an assistant sort of do the first pass on the painting, like
oh yeah.
do
Oh
the
yeah.
sky or whatever?
Oh yeah. Well, they would do a lot of the underdrafts. A lot of times it's really hard, if depending on the level of the assistant, to know which was rendered by the assistant, which was rendered
Oh,
by
amazing.
the artist. And
That's
so
a,
you have historians debating that.
that's amazing. I didn't know that. So
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So yeah, it's the first drafts person. It, it's an
Yeah, sure.
automated
Yeah.
drafts person.
Yeah, sure. It's you could just think you could personify it. Excuse me. You can you can personify it and just think of this person as like another, pair of hands in your studio who
Yep.
can do things super, super quickly in a million different ways. And that's great for you to have. Now the question, I've long since thought that the creativity is not going to be limited by the tool, but by the person using it. Now that we all have these assistants that can all pretty much do anything, it's very interesting how quickly you find yourself in front of a prompt, prompt for this amazing assistant of yours, and you run out of things to ask it to do, right? The limitation on creativity is going to be on most, on the user's end.
Yeah, I mean, I could give, again, I'm thinking about writing because that's where I have some expertise. I could get a student to write a rough draft or prompt GPT or whatever to write a rough draft of something, but there's no way they're going to be able to get it. They could prompt it all day long, but they just don't know how to write well. They don't know the tone I'm looking for, the sentence
Right.
structure I'm looking for, the flow I'm looking for. So
Right.
give it to them all day. They're just not going to get there.
Right. And that's exactly the case with with the image generating stuff. And that's why I think I saw so little of it being used in these like student, for senior portfolios,
Yeah.
is because you can't get it, at least now, to that final point of perfection that is truly expressive of you.
Okay. So last thing, I mean, you've done a lot to persuade me that there's no real genuine threat, I don't think, to human creativity or something along those lines. There's still plenty of ways in which artists will come to express themselves in concert with generative AI, not merely despite it, but in concert with it because of it. Someone might be a phenomenal artist in the way that they use generative AI, but they're otherwise not very good. In the way that, could be really good at photography, but not really good at painting. But you have also, I think, now convinced me that there is a jobs problem, because it is the drafts person. It is the junior person. So then, so one, is that right? Shouldn't students be legitimately nervous that not students of fine art who want to go and be artists and, I don't know where artists live now. It used to be Dumbo in Brooklyn, and where do they live now?
Ridgewood.
Fine.
I mean, if
Really?
we're talking to a New York audience.
Ridgewood? Okay, so fine. So those they're fine. They'll I mean, they'll be fine in their creative endeavors, or as fine as they've ever been. But for those students who have an eye towards, getting a job at whether it's anything from a startup to a corporation, it just looks like that drafts person can get cut out. I'm going to hire some sort of more senior level people to be those creative directors to, instead of having, I don't know, a couple of dozen first drafts people, I have, one prompt person, and then I have some people edit that stuff. So why won't it? Well, it'll augment the job of a given individual. It'll decrease jobs, for those entry level positions, which then raises the problem about how you get the pipeline to senior level people. But that's a separate problem.
So this is definitely going to be tried, right? So we're going to be able to see this experiment play out. Now, my inclination is to think that it's not going to work, and it's not going to work for the same reason that it doesn't work for the professional. Like any of these agencies, if we're talking about design agencies that have clients, if you're talking about your Nike, your McDonald's, any of these, or any real company that has, cares about its image, they are going to be very particular about what it is that they want and that what's going to represent their brand. And again, this level of it doesn't matter how far down the stack you go.
Sure. I mean, you have brand standards and you want, things need to look the Nike way or whatever it is.
Yeah, things need to look the Nike way. And also this campaign that you're creating, everything needs to be pitch perfect.
Yeah.
And you just can't, you're not going to get there. I don't care how far down the stack you go with generative AI. There are going to be organizations that don't care so much. Maybe your local newspaper, maybe even a big corporation for whom their audience, can't tell the difference between, or doesn't care
like
about.
they're B2B, and
It could be
nobody
B2B.
cares about
It
the
could,
branding.
yeah, right. Could be, some TV channel that needs a commercial for XYZ. And so, for that, but my argument would be that they're not hiring these kinds of people now anyway. I don't think. And so for the organizations that, for whom good enough is going to be good enough, they're not the types of organizations that have been spending money typically on hiring freelancers to do this X, Y, or Z. They're just typically to go without it.
Right.
So I don't, there will definitely be fields that will be challenged. I think photography has a very, interesting set of challenges before it. It'll be very interesting to see how it adapts. There, illustration is another one that I know, people in the field view this technology as encroaching upon, and again, if the AI can replicate that exact style, there was a famous case of this illustrator, Greg Rakowski, who kind of did he kind of did these illustrations in style of like a mythical lore, kind of Game of Thrones type, imagery, dragons and such. And his imagery, I don't know, he won the bad luck lottery and just became ingested into these image generating machines, and people were now able to create work in the style of Greg Rakowski for nothing. And his livelihood has been, I think, impacted, and he has very little control over his style. I do think that this stuff will play out in the courts as, being able to ingest copyrighted works is going to become
artists are suing, Getty Images is suing.
All these organizations and individuals are suing. I do think they, just basic copyright protections, which guarantee the financial viability of your creative enterprise, should prevail, just from a common sense point of view. So hopefully if we can get that kind of squared away and artists are protected, Adobe just did a really fantastic job with their AI that they launched called Firefly, which is only been trained on rights images for which Adobe has the rights to. Well, you're creating quote unquote clean imagery using the Adobe brand, which is great. And that as an institution, that's definitely something, at SVA, something that we look for. So, hopefully those issues will be hammered out in the courts, and we will have, ethically derived image generation machine tooling.
But that's really interesting with the Adobe thing, because it's gonna get tried out in the courts in various ways, but startups might play it fast and loose, but there's lots of organizations out there that are going to be sufficiently risk averse, legally risk averse, to not just use any generative AI because they don't have the training data, could contain IP. And so if there is on the market a sort of IP worry-free Gen AI to use, then just use that.
Yeah.
And so market pressures plus fear of lawsuit might make it happen.
Yeah.
All right. Great. This has been great. I think the sort of basic takeaway is, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Except unless you're an illustrator and maybe if you're a photographer.
No, I think that, for me, the takeaway is everybody's going to have to evolve, but it's not going to be as it was. Obviously, the bar for what constitutes creativity will rise. Certain professions will probably have to deal with that, more quickly than others. But as a creative professional or as a student learning, training in some sort of creative domain, this new tool represents a hurdle that you have to clear. And in the end, it should make culture richer. We should be better off for having, individuals who can achieve higher levels of creativity.
Yeah.
And for, the democratization of image generation, I think will go a long way in helping a lot of other people get ideas off the ground.
Let me try another. That's nice, but we should close there because that's a nice closing, but we're not.
But we're not going to.
One last thing. You have this metaphor of overcome a hurdle. How do you like this metaphor, though? It seems to me like you're saying something like, look, there's like the building of artistic expression, and some of the floors might catch on fire, and we might have to rebuild those floors or build new floors, but the foundations are fine. This is not disrupting the foundations of artistic or creative endeavors.
Yeah, I like your fiery analogy.
Beautiful. All right, great. Well, see, that's where we'll end then. All right.
All right.
Thanks, Eric. I'll talk to you
Thank
later.
you. All right.